Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. And should I say Shabbat Shalom to all of our Jewish viewers? Of course, it is that day. You should be seeing this by a Saturday at noon, is when I think I have this scheduled to put out. Of course, for those of you in the Eastern Standard Time, which is the proper time zone, at least so far as the Western Hemisphere is concerned. But that is aside the point. And I'm just going to start out with some general Middle Eastern news, and there isn't much to report. There isn't really much sense in putting the map up for Syria this episode, and that's not because I'm having internet trouble and it won't load. Don't get me wrong, that's certainly not the case here. But probably the biggest news out of Syria is that Naftali Bennett, of course, the new prime minister, the successor to Benjamin Netanyahu, has agreed to uphold the pre existing agreements with Russia. Now, of course, Turkey is also coming down on northern Syria. People are speculating that northern Syria is something of a powder keg right now. Now, we'll see how that does turn out. And there was actually some activity in that pocket of southwestern Syria along the Jordanian border with some damages to a Syrian government garrison there. And the main activity, aside from the agreement between Russia and Israel, or should I say the reaffirmment of the agreement between Russia and Israel, is that there has just been these small skirmishes across Syria, particularly in Homs, with ISIS suicide bombers, and with, of course, the just irregular terrorist attacks committed against Syrian forces. And also, there was the 24 people who were sentenced to death over the wildfires that were previously in Syria. The government, whether by legitimate means or not, determined that these people were instigators, provocateurs, and frankly arsonists, and put them to death over this. Now, given the state of things in Syria, that's not really a surprise that something like that would happen there. I could certainly see that, and frankly, while I haven't seen the evidence, I have no reason to disbelieve that arson is the case. Of course, there have been skirmishes also in the pocket of, again, southwestern Syria, again, near the Golan Heights. And really, not much else out of Syria. And as for Lebanon, which we covered extensively last week, last night, the 21st convoy, comprising of 60 Iranian, uh, consisting of 60 tankers of Iranian fuel, was destined for Lebanon, has left Syria. So it looks like the Iranians are stepping in to provide some economic relief, which isn't a surprise that they're trying to gain influence there. And the finance minister is currently in talks with the IMF, trying to sell the soul of the country even more to get out of this temporary economic crisis. You know how these sort of things go. Hezbollah had their parade, they've been showing off, and they also claim that they have 100,000 fighters at their disposal, which I think may be a bit of an exaggerated claim. However, that's not to discount that Hezbollah, of course, has increased power the past decade at least. And of course, the U.S. State Department is in mediating talks between Lebanon and Israel regarding this entire crisis. In fact, they're negotiating on the maritime borders right now, and the European Union is also, I imagine, upon French initiative, has, quote, wants to punish the Lebanese personalities who will obstruct reforms or elections. So that's just a general rundown of what's happening in the Middle East. Those are the main two topics. There is some activity regarding Yemen that is developing, so keep your eye on that. We'll probably cover that over the next week or so as things become more developed with that, unless you have anything I missed. And that's.
Well, I mean,
Go ahead.
the only thing I have to expand upon is basically you can see. I think the development of a broader strategy at work um, with regards to Lebanon and Hezbollah. I think, I mean, we've talked about this before, but I think the West is seeking, particularly Israel, as sort of, part of the broader West, is seeking a civil war in Lebanon. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but that is one of the, I think one of the things that they want to see happen there. So, I can't prove, the intent and whatever other machinations are going on, but I think Israel is concerned about not just Hezbollah, but Hezbollah's ability to even work with Hamas, which came as a surprise in May when there was that skirmish, pretty violent skirmish between the Israelis and the Palestinians. For Syria, things are ramping up. Uh, Erdogan is promising to use heavy artillery, as if he hasn't already, but he's promising even heavier machinery to be deployed at the front lines in the north and northwest area of the contact point between Turkey and Syria. He's going both after the various Kurdish factions fighting against him and the Syrian army proper, because so far, working in concert with Russian Aerospace Command, Russia and Syria has been constantly putting pressure on Idlib and areas adjacent to Idlib that are under more or less full Turkish control. So, I think we're going to see. We'll probably, this again will pop up later as we discuss, say, European use. But broadly speaking, the West wants to see a conflict begin in Ukraine, a civil war in Libya, and a conflict begin for the Chinese in the South China Sea, particularly around the issue of Taiwan. But that's all I really
Yeah,
have
and we'll
to
also get into
expand
the
upon.
story about the Chinese missile tests and some of the claims about those, and really just general East Asian politics. But that's all we had for the brief Middle Eastern news. It's usually a bit heavier than that, which I suppose in this context, no news is good news as things begin to stabilize in Syria and at least I should say somewhat stabilize in Syria because what
Yeah. Well,
Erdogan
I mean,
has. Do go ahead.
we can mention that in Dara, the peace negotiations are going on still very smoothly. So
Yeah,
there were a
funny how that
couple of
works. In all the
horrible attacks.
areas that are controlled by the government, peace talks and negotiations seem to be going smoothly, but all the areas controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces seem to be a powder keg. Funny how that
Yeah.
works, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there was a very, I guess, maybe we'll just say one last thing, and that is 14 SAA soldiers of the Syrian army were killed in a bomb planted on a military bus carrying them just on the outskirts of Damascus. This is pretty major. To me, this says very, very sophisticated planning and infiltration. Well, no group that we recognize has claimed responsibility. It is a small faction. It could very well be part of U.S. and Western intelligence that has done this, meaning that the group is essentially non-existent. It's been given some name, you know, very quickly, and yeah, we don't really know anything about them.
Naturally, and as happens all the time, these groups splinter off from each other, form new organizations, merge into new ones. It's a constantly changing dynamic, especially under that much pressure and instability. But moving on from that, we do have some brief European news, and trust me, it's no big deal that Russia has more or less followed suit with what they did with the European Union and suspended diplomatic or relations with NATO as an organization. Now, individual countries they will still cooperate with, they will still continue with normal diplomacy, but similar to what they did with the European Union, I believe it was back in February or March, they have said we're no longer going to diplomatically engage with you as an organization, more or less. You could say revoking the recognition of this organization or revoking the chance that talks have anything to do with it. And people have been speculating, oh, is this the brink of a NATO Russia war? How will this turn out? And there was a pretty good, of all places, Twitter thread by Brian McDonald, who is a journalist. Now, don't let that scare you off or fool you. And he was elaborating on Stoltenberg's comments about NATO leadership and the purpose of the bloc, and really pointing out that you have this very confrontational attitude towards Russia in Poland, the Baltic states, some parts of Eastern Europe, and the UK. Whereas in places like Germany and France, the other big players on the continent, and when it comes to the EU and NATO, they have a more neutral, maybe sometimes adversarial, but ultimately are willing to cooperate with Russia. That's their approach. And of course, all the minor countries either fall into one of those blocks. For example, depending on who you ask and really depending on what situation it is, you could group countries like Romania and some of the Baltic states, not, well, the Baltic states, of course, but the Balkan countries into that very anti Russia sort of coalition. And it does raise the question that there's only a few possibilities for this ending. And again, lifting from what he had to say, I don't entirely agree with this assessment, but I will say that it's probably the most accurate I've seen. That the only four possibilities are, of course, Russia and NATO come to an understanding that would probably see Russia ascending into the alliance like they were discussing in the late 90s and early 2000s. Russia implodes again, even further than what did when the Soviet Union collapsed. NATO itself implodes, or they trade blows and go to war. Now, I think the first two are out of the question. I don't think Russia is going to dissolve anytime soon or fall into any sort of irreparable state. And I also don't see a renewed friendly relationship with the West, with NATO in particular. I mean, I could see, and again, things would have to be much more volatile than they are now because things are relatively calm, all things considered. I know that tensions are high and that they've been high since about 2016, 2017. Really, you want to go back to Crimea as the initial incident of that, with pretty much late Obama Trump policy towards Russia. But in recent years, as things have really backed off, as the American empire has lost some credibility and began to look more internally, you could say 2019, 2020, especially with the whole pandemic thing, that outright aggression towards Russia that we saw from about 2014 to 2017, 2018 has really tapered off. And it would take, I don't know, some major incident between the two, maybe a Ukrainian ascension to NATO, maybe again Russia indulges the fear mongers and tries to invade Estonia or something. It would have to come to something that would actually require NATO to live up to its commitments to show that, again, while you may have the Poles and the Lithuanians and the Baltic states, and again some other European countries, Eastern European countries, and the UK may be ready to confront Russia. Number one, talking about a conflict and actually waging conflict are much different things. When the body bags start coming home, the opinions probably changed, frankly, on both sides. And also, that plays into it, how many people in France or Germany are willing to support a war over the sovereignty of a country like Estonia? I don't think there are many in Western
Yeah.
Europe outside of the UK and maybe a few isolated other cases, particularly in urban areas. Like I'm sure that the um, French urbanites, some of them at least might support it. And even then, that's a bit of a stretch. But again, I don't see them wanting to commit to not only a war. I, if you want to put things in perspective, countries like France and Germany were hesitant and actually outright refused to go into Iraq, which was a country that was coming apart at the seams. And that was in 2003 when things 2002, 2003 when things were much more stable. Why, as things have become much less stable and frankly worse all around when it comes to geopolitical affairs at least, would they want to commit to a war against another industrialized power that is probably, minus the United States at this point, the most powerful military force in the world, certainly the most powerful military force in the European continent? Why why would a country that was hesitant to go to war against Saddam Hussein's crumbling regime want to go to war again against one of the top militaries in the world? It doesn't add up. And I'm not saying that is anytime soon, but I do think that NATO, in a sense, is a paper tiger. That's what I'm getting at. That if Article 5 were to be triggered on one of these peripheral countries, if you will, that these they wouldn't be willing to. Now, the only exception I could see is if by some chain of events Russia ended up invading Poland, however unlikely that is. I think that might drive them to action, but antagonizing the Baltic states, Ukraine, or even just the Donbass and Crimea, or whatever situation in Georgia, I don't think those issues have the capability of driving European sentiment against Russia to the point where they would want to take up arms against them.
Right, and it's also incredibly contradictory where they antagonize Russia and of course make gas deals, but with Russia. But I mean, I you can already probably hear the narrative should it come down to that, that the war is at home, it's in Europe, we must do something. But I'm with you. I don't expect NATO to start a war with Russia anytime soon. I think what they're looking forward to is the possibility of, say, a war beginning again in Ukraine as they attempted in April of this year. And then there's a remote possibility that they could do something to antagonize Kaliningrad, and then that would force the hand of Russia and Belarus to do something. Apart from those, there's no scenario. The NATO already has a difficult time mustering up the forces in order to defend the Baltic states. Russia has no plan, no desire to take over the Baltic states or Poland or even Ukraine for that matter. The point is to create a scenario where Russia would be forced to enter. So, apart from, let's say, beginning to treat ethnic Russians like second citizens in Lithuania, for example. Um, it would have to be some kind of gross human rights violation to take place in order to even raise the ire of the Russians. Russia isn't going to fall for any of these tricks. So the long march in order to fracture Russia, along the Brzezinski doctrine since 1979 has not worked. I think they expected breakthroughs in the 2000s, and that Ukraine was part of that breakthrough by adding so much external pressure and the demoralization of the country. They were hoping to capture Russian liberals sympathetic to the West and to begin, let's say, the process of a new Russia, right? That would be liberalism 2.0. Um, um, Liberalism 1.0 from the 90s would be vindicated. Um, and then there would have been the possibility of a fracturing by, let's say, in the same way that It would begin with certain regions gaining more autonomy in Russia along, let's say, ethnic lines, like the Yakuts, like the various Turkic groups that live in Russia. But that's way off. That is not happening, and so that the best that they can hope for, just to go back to old ground I've already covered, is it would be to cause a war in Ukraine. I think that's the primary battlefield that they want to see, with minimal American and European involvement.
Which they've been
Ukraine
trying to
would
do
take the
for 8 years
brunt of
at
that.
this point. Just bear in mind.
Right, right. I do think if things continue to escalate, let's say further Russian and Belarusian integration starts to develop, then the West will look at that as an act of aggression, because this would ostensibly put Russia on the border of NATO, in the same way that Ukraine becoming a full member of NATO would do likewise. That's a possibility. So Russia has already stated in recent comments from Peskov and others, including Lavrov, that if Ukraine and Georgia ascend to NATO, that will be a red line. That could be like a use of the basic fundamentals of the Kaliningrad strategy, where it is cordoned off, and then that creates an emergency scenario. Since the Russians have stated that they do not want to see either of these states, for security reasons, ascend into NATO, then ascending them into NATO de facto does the same thing. It would call on Russia. Russia has said it would actively stop it. It's it's vague, but it hints at the possibility of physical actions, not merely more abstract actions like sanctions and severing of ties over, let's say, various institutions, or closing down embassies, and so on and so on.
And that's the thing. It's at this standstill that we saw in Syria for the longest time, and one could even say Lebanon, where the desire for conflict is certainly there, but the
Mm-hmm.
desire to be the instigator in the conflict is not, because they realize that, well, yes, we want Russia to get bogged down in a conflict in Georgia or Ukraine or wherever, or the Baltics, but they realize in order to do that, they would actually have to, in some way, shape, or form, wage a conflict. Now, as we saw, they've tried outsourcing this to these more minor countries, again, as we saw with Ukraine, trying to put
Mm-hmm.
them into the meat grinder. But I think as much as NATO wants, as much as the West might want it, they realize that, well, if we provoke a Russian response, we also have to respond to that. We actually have to, put blood and treasure on the line in order to counter this move that we baited Russia into. And that's really where it gets to that, where they certainly had the desire to, but they don't have the stomach or wherewithal to. And I'm not saying that the Russians are much different in that sense, because I do think that the Russians do have a desire to assert themselves more, but they also have a bit of a weaker stomach when it comes to actually committing to any large scale action. Now, I think compared between the two, that they probably have more wherewithal when you put them side by side, but having more wherewithal than NATO or a Western power, frankly, isn't saying much. Now, I'm not saying the Russians are going to turn tail run at the first opportunity, but I do think that as much as a desire may be there by certain segments of the population, maybe even certain segments of the Russian elite, I don't know, there also is that apprehension there, thinking that, well, if we trade blows, it's going to be
Mhm.
a very large conflict, and that's not even bringing in the question of nuclear. Even though somebody did make an interesting point the other day, which did somewhat change my perspective on modern great power conflicts, and they pointed out that there wasn't an instance in World War II where either side deployed chemical weapons on an opposing force. And again, we're talking about chemical weapons, weapons of mass destruction. And they said, well, what I took from that at least is, well, I mean, maybe the same could be applied to nukes, and they outright said like they were the nukes of their day, and you saw how they were in World War I, and it does sort of put a new lens on it, at least for me, because I've always thought that, well, these conflicts are prevented by nuclear weapons, and any of these conflicts will escalate into nuclear weapons inevitably. But I don't know. It makes me think about it in
Yeah,
a different
I
way,
mean,
where you could see like maybe like not for long, but you could see the conflicts being much more conventional than most people would think.
yeah, yeah. I mean, what they want is dramatic change with the least amount of blood possible, right? That's why they've chosen color revolutions, sanctions, efforts to woo China away from Russia, Russia away from China, which aren't really much wooing because they're essentially threats. And I think the other strategy is that if Russia does involve itself in a war and it loses, that China will at that point no longer want to work closely with Russia, that it will not look at Russia as a secure partner, a capable partner for the future. It is very obvious now that um, uh, other than the most official statements, Russia and China effectively are allies. That's obvious now. I think there's no question. Um, so they want to see that alliance broken because I think they understand that that alliance itself is stronger than the U.S. and it is certainly stronger than NATO, and of course, it's certainly stronger than any Pacific power. Um, so that's the challenge: how to separate these two behemoths. And I guess we could talk about the Taliban visiting Moscow this week and what that is likely to mean now that America is effectively out of Central Asia. And so Russia is ready to no longer recognize the Taliban as a terrorist organization, and this is mostly, you know, for for pragmatic reasons. Also, they've won. Uh, they've won this conflict, but the conflict itself is complex. Uh, I don't know if we mentioned, but during the summer, as the Taliban was gaining rapidly more and more land, and then it finally took over Kabul, there were two strange incidences in Pakistan where buses were used, explosions occurred, and um, ethnic Chinese, some of them higher up in business and government, died. These were most likely terrorist attacks that pinpointed them. And again, I would say that whoever did this, they're Western aligned because they want to keep China out of Central Asia, and for that matter, they want Russia out of Central Asia. This is why ISIS K uh, is, I personally believe is attacking all these Shia mosques. We've
Yeah,
had
we never
two
did figure out
devastating
what the K
attacks.
stands for, but do go on.
Yeah, so there were two mosques that were bombed by suicide bombers. They killed dozens in each one. So division is fomenting in Afghanistan. They don't want Afghanistan to be cohesive in any way. And you can see that the Taliban reaching out to Moscow is a way to gain some kind of not just legitimacy but stability, right? So China and Russia are willing to engage economically with the Taliban in order to begin infrastructure projects. And um, Afghanistan really, like its civil war, basically undid much of the infrastructure that the Soviets had brought in, and then now we're at a point where even more, let's say more modern infrastructure. I'm talking about like Wi-Fi signals, you know, let's say infrastructure concerning commerce and electricity is now far more available than it was before America entered, right? So I think the Taliban, part of the reason that they're reaching out to Russia and China is, first of all, there's no doctrine uh, 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 for the Taliban to essentially agree. There's no Western doctrine for them to agree with. There are caveats, of course. Uh, no, no heroin trade, no poppy fields. Um, the Chinese and the Russians don't care really if girls go to school or not. That's you know, or if there's gay rights, it's not a concern. So it's up to the other things that came out of that meeting were that America is responsible for helping in the restructure program that the Afghans are seeking. Of course, I mean, it baffles me in many ways why they would even make that statement, and even the Russians repeated it. Well, I mean, the Americans are not going to help with any infrastructure project. They're going to help like various groups and factions so that Afghanistan plunges into a new civil war. They're not, and the 11 billion that they took from Afghanistan is ostensibly never coming back. So um, that's where that is.
Oh, certainly, and just seeing the move on from them being a terrorist organization according to the Russian state to being recognized more or less as legitimate government is not a surprise, but I think if you watch our previous episodes or if you've kept up the situation in the past few months, you'll realize that Russia in particular was very wary about taking that final step to actually recognize the Taliban. Now, they weren't antagonistic. Nobody thought they were actually going to gear up for war, but people were thinking that they were going to take a much more cautious approach than China, who seemed to be very willing to accept Taliban control of Afghanistan. And maybe it was through their relationship with China and coming to an agreement on that issue, or just looking internally. But it does look like that Russia has overcome that. And I saw again some Russian commentators saying that back when the Taliban first took Kabul about in August of this year, that they should be wary about the Taliban because of what influence it might have on the Islamic organizations in Russia. So I don't,
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't attest much to that situation. I don't have too much of an insight on that. Maybe we will have to bring File Ferengian back on to explain that to us. But it will be interesting to see what this does to the Russian Muslim population, what their response in particular will be with that, because Russia, the modern Russian state, from my observation, from what I've seen about it, has a very very odd relationship with Islam and Muslims, where it's not outright antagonistic, but it's nowhere near to the degree that Western states are. It seems to be again break down like along ethnic and hard borders, with I think Chechnya being the most pressing example, where they exist functionally as tributary states within Russia. At least in the case of Chechnya, I imagine that some of these other Muslim majority regions or Muslim plurality regions probably function much the same. And like I said, it will be interesting to see how this influences the internal situation when it comes to the Russian state's relationship to Islam and Muslims. But ultimately, I don't see this as too much of a surprising development at this point, unless they were willing to support some sort of parallel government. I don't know, maybe like another Northern Alliance, something like that. There's really no way around recognizing the Taliban, which I would say applies for every country that wants to have any sort of interest in Afghanistan, which Russia being right there, having it right there in Central Asia in its backyard, China sharing an actual border with it, it was more or less inevitable that they're either going to have to A, accept the Taliban, or B, foment a complete opposition movement and start another civil war in Afghanistan in order to put a more favorable government in power instead of cooperating with the existing one. And it looks like whatever they may think of the Taliban personally, whatever policies they may have that differs, whatever condemnations that they may theoretically have, those have been put aside for the sake of pragmatism. And I don't see it as like a very short term thing. I think they're willing to accept that, well, of course, Muslim tribals rule Afghanistan. It's Afghanistan. And that they're not going to do what the West does, which is the chiding over human rights or women's rights or whatever. But speaking of which, did you hear that the West, it's really racking up those cultural victories? Did you hear that the U.S. State Department is celebrating International Pronouns Day?
I had no idea. But just to touch on what you were saying about like the Russian concerns over the Taliban and the greater Muslim question within Russia, I would say that you can make the counter argument quite effectively um, if you look at Russia helping Afghanistan develop itself economically, infrastructure. That would be overall a good sign amongst Islamic Russians. These are, you know, we should also remember these Islamic Russians aren't ethnically Russian. These people are of different ethnicities, often a different race altogether. Um, the Chechen War itself, although yes, it did use Islam, was mostly an ethnic war, and a lot of it had to deal with Stalin's forced removal of Chechens from their homeland into Central Asia and so on. So there are a lot of grievances. Islam was used, and Russia is happy to use Islam as the boogeyman, in these scenarios. But most Muslims in Russia are actually neither Sunni nor Shia. They are Sufi, which is a much, much more moderate and quite a different form of Islam that developed in the Caucasus and in Central Asia over a long period of time. So you could look at that. There's a there's an opportunity here that Russia could gain,
Oh,
um,
certainly, and
especially
just
if
showing goodwill towards
Afghanistan being so
showing goodwill towards a Muslim state
right,
may
right.
increase internal approval. And as you were saying, a lot of it does have to do with like hard borders and ethnicity as well. I mean, I suppose when you get down to it, a lot of religion and ethnicity are intertwined. Not entirely, but they're very similar issues, very similar identities when it comes to that. And you get into that double-edged sword of autonomy, where it's again Chechnya. It may be a bit of exaggeration, but for example, functionally exist as a tributary state, a vassal state within Russia, where they have vastly different internal laws that govern Chechnya. Of course, I'm sure I remember the LGBTQ CIA concentration camp controversy that went around there for a while. But more or less, as long as they're loyal to Moscow, to the Russian state, that they're left to govern themselves within the borders of their internal region.
Right. Yeah.
But with that being said, it does create a new dynamic, and I also think it does solidify this sinking of the American empire into a less active role, if not a sinking of the empire in general. And speaking of sinking in empires, should we discuss the current logistics crisis within the United States?
Yeah, sure.
So, still, we have those shipping containers sitting offshore, and it's actually starting to lead to substantial shortages. I'm sure you've all seen the pictures of the empty store shelves of the dairy sections having no milk available, and the very conspicuous effort by a lot of people, both in the mainstream media and even it is funny among like these self-proclaimed leftists. Now, again, I know hypocrisy is one of the lowest arguments there is, but it's this very strange running of defense for the regime and big capital in their incompetence because they're saying, well, okay, the supply shortages aren't that bad, and look, what there's shortages of there aren't even necessities. Why do you need milk? Blah blah blah. Again, like really stupid things. You're like, oh, well, you can't have your luxury good or your treats at the grocery store. How tragic! Again, like just mocking these supply shortages. In which case, you would think even from like a pragmatic case, the self-proclaimed leftists, the self-proclaimed communists, wouldn't they be just chomping at the bit to say this is a failure of capitalism? Which, in my opinion, in some ways,
Right.
yes, it is. But it does seem like again, it's this wedding of the so-called dissidents and the regime. And I'm not saying there isn't a right-wing equivalent for that. I think the entire Trump era and the so-called MAGA movement is a very real depiction of that. But again, it's just uh, this weird dynamic I just wanted to point out there. But actually getting into the meat and bones or lack thereof of the shortages, again, they're starting to have noticeable effects. Prices are going up, and it does seem like, following the theme of the administration, that Biden has been relatively silent on this. There hasn't been really an official statement yet. I mean, he's been busy, of course, going on and on about these mandates thing. That's been the primary concern of the federal government, apparently. And that also gets into the controversy about our transportation secretary, Pete Buttigieg. I'm sure you all remember him. He ran for president. He was the guy creating the CIA lab for you know, the purposes of actually getting him elected. Again, you look at everything about his background. This man was like, I know it's funny considering his personal sexual preferences. Quite literally, seem to have been groomed for his role in politics. Well, it turns out because him and his domestic partner have either adopted a child or again, however those kind of people reproduce that isn't you know what. But all jokes aside, apparently he has been on an indefinite leave that started back in August, and which when you're a high level, like again, I get it, like if you're like an office worker, blue collar worker, I'm sure take time off of work. Your company won't die without you. You'll be fine if you're on like a paid leave for like a month and a half, 2 months, whatever. But when you're a high level cabinet secretary in the middle of a major political issue involving what your department is responsible for in particular, it does seem oddly conspicuous that all of a sudden he's just on leave for these 2 months. Now, of course, you can't blame the supply shortages on the absence of one, cabinet secretary. That's not how this regime functions. This regime is a very, it's again, it's a, believe it or not, is incompetent as it seems at times, still has remnants of being a just a self-sustaining system that it once was. And looking at that, looking at what it is, the absence of one really figurehead isn't going to bring the thing down because of course you have the undersecretary, the entire bureaucracy under him, but it is conspicuous that I'm not trying to speculate too much. I'm sure he actually is with his quote unquote kid and his quote unquote husband, but it does seem like they're trying to push him out of the spotlight for these couple months, push him out of Washington for whatever reason. Now, I don't know whether that's some internal power game going on in Washington and going on in the White House, but it all these things taken in isolation, whether that be shortages of certain goods, shipping containers offshore, the whole debacle with the Department of Transportation, none of those things raise my eyebrow in particular, which is why I haven't discussed any of them individually. But when you put them together, I can't even quite put words to it. There's just something that seems very off about all of it to me. And maybe it's just the consequence of living in a dying empire where these sort of things become commonplace. But again, just looking at the big picture of this, I feel like there's something they're obviously not telling us, but there's something I can't even find the words to extrapolate at this point.
Right. Another reason that's been given for the shortages comes uh, from Wally Ademo. Uh, Back about October 15th, he made a statement that the supply chain, the boats aren't going to dock, and the supply chain isn't going to get back to normal until everyone is jabbed. Now he's the deputy secretary of the Treasury. Uh, he's basically Biden's second highest official in the Treasury Department, which is a very interesting statement to make. Uh, in other words, these shortages are directly connected to uh, the insistence on the administration to get everyone vaccinated. And, it's my belief that the vaccination itself is, well, I mean, it's many things. It's profits, uh, but it will also be a form of showing compliance, trust, and fealty to, essentially to the elite of America. Um, in the future, of course, it will be used for monitoring people. The other thing that it does in the present is it distinguishes friend and foe. It creates a friend and foe distinction. So that lets them know how many people are hardcore, for whatever reasons, against them that they see as potential enemies in the future. Um, it's been said that we're moving in some ways out of an ideological period that we saw uh, come to its height in the mid 20th century. We had the opposite essentially. It was the height of ideology. Now ideology is still used, of course. So you know all the all the sad uh, you know all the sad arguments against the vaccine mandates where they call everybody who doesn't agree with them as commies or Nazis. They're enormously ineffective because ideologically, the West is going to push uh, further into liberalism's frontier of uh, individual expression and freedom seeking, right? So, uh, liberalism 1.0 was you can change everything. You can change your relationship to nature, but you can't change your relationship with human nature. And so Western democracies are already well into their liberalism 2.0. So that's why trans people are promoted so heavily, gay people are promoted so heavily, um, because that is a way that to distinguish themselves, let's say, from previous iterations, not only of liberalism, but other ideologies like communism and Nazism or fascism, right? So those labels don't stick. And the magatard types, and like, they don't realize how ineffective they are, because for them, um, the exaltation of, let's say, people of color, trans, gays, is uh, is how you distinguish the difference between authoritarian regimes and non-authoritarian regimes. Liberals who are on board with this, for them, like, that's the real proof in the pudding. That's really how you can distinguish whether they're really Nazis or not,
Yeah,
right?
and like
And
even Putin came out this week and
yeah,
made something that sounded like would have been said on conservative talk radio. Now, again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but just these very generic things like, oh, of course, children shouldn't be transitioning, and you shouldn't, be teaching people to flog themselves over their own history. Again, pretty much just like red meat. And again, maybe this is a new tactic of the Russian state, the Russian um, foreign policy, just pandering to these more conservative and right wing and distant talking points. Again, you see this in RT and Sputnik all the time, but from Putin's mouth
Mhm.
himself is a bit of an escalation on that. And again, I think that also plays into the point where it's like if you don't like the LGBTQ CIA or half of your board of directors being women, you must be a vile authoritarian who wants to oppress these groups and uh, hates everyone except blah 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 blah. And again, it's a very convenient distinction in their mind. Now, how it pans out in the reality doesn't matter. It's how they view reality is where they really get you. And again, I think you made a good point with all of that, with their frankly perception of the world, and going into, of course, the what mandates and all of that. Again, as we keep on touching on, this is the last ditch effort of a regime that's more or less pulled out all the stops, and of course they're being very aggressive about this to the point where they're even willing to, I don't know, maybe they're just not long-term thinkers. I could see them just being so desperate that they make a fatal mistake like this, that they're willing to disrupt their entire economy and frankly the global economy in order to make sure everyone complies with this new mandate, with their new cure-all. We're going to save you and save our civilization. Just listen to us and accept this thing from our corporate partners, sort of deal. And again, it is. And I think as we've touched on this, you go back about 3 or 4 episodes ago. I think we covered this at length, where it is about loyalty and it's about showing that they are still useful and that they still have a role to serve, and that you can't discard us. Look, you need us for this miracle cure. What would you ever do without it? Despite the fact that, again, um, looking at the actual efficacy and in fact the risks of what, and the fact that other countries such as Russia and China have also produced the same thing, and at least in the case of the Russians, you could argue more effective and less risky. But I do think you ultimately make a good point about how, yeah, at the end of the day, a lot of people tend to forget that these things do all tie together, that you cannot separate one issue from the other. At the end of the day, it all is the behemoth that, for convenience
Mhm.
sake, we'll just call liberalism.
Right, right, and that is essentially what's being challenged, right? So liberalism itself has had to become, in some ways, pragmatic, and some ways more authoritarian. Uh, but again, it relies on finding those members of society that represent the frontier of, let's say, personal expression, right, where uh, one's own nature within is overcome. In this way, you could argue that it has some similarities with communism. The two are related, uh, but it's this idea of overcoming nature. Before, it was, prior to that, it was essentially um, overcoming nature in order to create more societal efficiency, creating new technologies. You can see this in the Industrial Revolution. I mean, that's when we have the Age of Enlightenment and so on. And but the frontier was always, but you can't change human nature, right? And of course, the idea that you can change human nature itself, uh, and that nature itself is this proto-fascistic force working against human desire, and the way human desire intersects with capitalism, that is all worked out. So they know why that they're promoting these ideas, right? They're not. There's nothing accidental about them. Um, and it's kind of sad that you see people on the right that don't understand, that fundamentally don't understand this argument. Like, in many ways, they really are living and in a time that time forgot. Like, uh, they're just not, they're just not where they need to be with. And the fact is, there is no combative ideology that can challenge this at the moment. Uh, Nonetheless, we are seeing more authoritarianism rising and more pragmatic approaches to maintain power. Um, I think in many ways, we've often talked about this on the show that the more diverse societies become, the more societal trust erodes, the more intergroup rivalries occur, the more authoritarianism will be necessary in order to keep Western societies intact. Now, I always maintained this. In my personal life, I've been saying this for 7 years. For me, the great moment that came about was in the spring of 2014. At that time, I understood that. Now, I could never have foreseen how, you know, couth mandates and all the rest of it would tie into that, how that could be utilized, that becomes the vehicle in order to solve this emergent problem within the West, right? Because that the other problem, of course, is that liberalism itself helped create uh, the population shortage that that also forced the situation that we're in right now.
And that's what makes it really insidious in regard to liberalism, isn't it? Because, as I'm sure our audience knows, neither of us are libertarians by any means. In fact, I would personally describe myself as a much more authoritarian person. I imagine you would as well. But what's really insidious about this is you have liberalism, which again sells you this bill of goods of freedom, the individual, all of this. But the moment that the individual, that freedom is used in a way that contradicts liberalism, they come down on you harder than anything. And when they sniff any sort of dissent, when they catch a whiff of that, it is, all everything is off the table, and you are an enemy of the state. And I think we're seeing this much more explicitly now with a lot of things you noted. But obviously, all ideologies, when pushed to their brink, will start to contradict themselves and fray. But at least from what I've noticed, liberalism is almost unique in the sense of how self contradictory and how hypocritical it becomes in the name of justifying itself and justifying its perpetuation to the point where, again, you have authoritarian states of the past, whether those be of a communist, fascist, monarchist, whatever ideology, whatever form of governance. It's usually very straightforward. It's these are the rules and you will obey them or else there will be consequences. Now, of course, that exists in the West, but it's this very insidious way of going about it. Now, of course, just with the nature of governments, they do exist in order to at least theoretically foster social stability and frankly for the good of the populace living there, so they're not living in an anarchic state such as say Somalia. But there's just something very insidious about I would say the way liberalism does it in particular. And you could argue that they have picked up some of these traits from more communist ideas, especially in the 20th century, as the neoconservative and later neoliberal movements, again, particularly the neoconservatives, ingrained themselves into the liberal system after being, spurned communists, particularly followers of Trotsky and his ideas. But even before that, even before the advent of communism, even when we're talking 18th century, 19th century liberalism, you still do have those elements. Now, don't get me wrong, I think 18th, 19th century liberalism would be vastly preferable to what we have today, but that doesn't mean it's
Yeah.
good. I mean, like, classical liberals look sane now because modern liberals have gone completely insane. But the ultimate point I'm getting at is, in my opinion at least, liberalism, especially when it starts to become undone, is particularly insidious about this, and maybe this is because this is the first time we've witnessed liberalism become undone, because it is a young idea. It is a ideology practiced by very few of the pre-existing civilizations, where we've seen monarchies, we've seen empires rise and fall for millennia at this point, and it usually takes more or less the same course or the same set of courses. Again, those things become very predictable. But as liberalism unphrase, something that's based on these quote unquote higher principles, as it unphrased, we're witnessing them trying to justify how they're still adhering to that while doing everything to violate those. And again, whether you agree or disagree with those, I certainly disagree with, I would say, most, if not all, of those principles. But it's just very insidious the lengths that they will go to both violate them again, the pursuit of quote unquote preserving them or saving them. And I think what it really boils down to is, while it may on the surface seem authoritarian and cracking down, in many ways it is, when you get to the root of the issue, it's just about chaos. And I think that is the end goal of liberalism. You could arguably say that's the end goal of communism. That isn't how it developed outside the Eastern Bloc, because I would say it much more reasonably stabilized stuff. But pretty much these Enlightenment ideology, I would say, at the root of all of them are chaos, degradation. That's fundamentally, whether they admit it or not, whether they even know it or not, their end goal is chaos.
Right, and they are having trouble managing it. I think the other point that uh, people on the right, even but especially moderate people on the right, who think like they're going to point out to the progressive left what real liberalism is. One of the things that they don't fundamentally understand is when you have a conversation with them and they say, "Are we going to go full Stalinism?" and you tell them, "No, but it's not for the reasons you think." So what don't they understand about that phrase? Well, what they don't understand is like even before the fall of the Soviet Union, um, techniques, in the managerial revolution, techniques on how to control the population differently than we did in the 20th century and prior to the mid 20th century uh, are already being developed, right? So it's not going to come down like they don't fundamentally understand that there isn't going to be like military on the streets enforcing this. And that's the problem. As long as they don't see that, they don't think they're living under like a totalitarian regime yet, right? Like it's like they don't understand that coercion for corporate power is how it's done now. You don't do it with like brutal force. You do it with coercion, right? You do it through the law. You do it through uh, ratcheting up economic pressure, like losing your job, like being tracked on various apps, like looking at what you posted 7 years ago. That's how you're going to get the compliance. It's not going to come with a knock on the door at 3 a.m. by, um, let's say, federal police or the army, right? And that's the problem because they think as long as that doesn't happen, okay, it's terrible, but I'm still not living in in Stalin's Russia or something.
Yeah, I think that
That's the essential problem.
I do think I see your point, certainly, where it's become an iron fist and a velvet glove sort of approach. And I do think that can be explained in particular. My own personal theory on that is, I think even intergenerationally, people are still traumatized by the sheer amount of carnage and violence just in the first half of the 20th century. That it
Right.
has
Yeah.
left again, like an intergenerational wound on all of Western civilization, and probably even parts outside of Western civilization. And funny enough, you do see this in places like Latin America or Africa. Now, again, certainly there's many other factors that do explain the violence and crime rate there, but you also have to remember these were places that were mostly spared from that cataclysmic carnage that you saw from, again, like the early 1900s up until, again, 1945 with the end of World War II, and even, again, going into some of the other conflicts uh, outside of the World Wars, getting into the Cold War, whatever. But I do think it's, you saw after, throughout the course of Western history, what I'm getting at, just to briefly put it this way, is there would be flare-ups of conflicts. Those conflicts would usually be very bloody. They would last a few years, except, in some notable cases they would last, for literally decades. You may think 30 years war, even how far that back that is. But they're resolved. They come to an understanding. A new order is generally established, and that holds until the next conflict. But the World Wars, seeing the full might of industrialized warfare, and again, just the absolute bloodshed that spread across Europe and even stretching into, you know, North America at that point with the intervention of the Americans and the Canadians. I do think that in the public consciousness and sort of a civilizational consciousness, if you will, it has created this great aversion to overt violence and overt control of people, where they do find these ways to weasel around because, frankly, people just don't have the stomach for it because
Mhm.
of what their forefathers went through. And you could say this is just some sort of ancestral memory, and frankly, I do believe it. I do believe, as much as it gets played up by certain groups, that intergenerational trauma is a thing, just on a society-wide or nationwide or civilizational-wide scale. That you do have these sort of collective memories, if you will, and it like you said, does create this problem because people have been lulled into this illusion thinking that, oh, well, the regime doesn't hate me. Sure, they may be a pain in my ass. Sure, they may make me do this, this, and this, or they do this, this, and this to me, but they're not forcing me to do it at gunpoint, so it's all okay. Where they, again, a lot of people, and frankly, I don't blame them. I think a lot of us were like that for a while. Is they don't realize that these new methods are the new gunpoint for the foreseeable future, and you're playing right into their trap when you don't realize that.
Right. Yes. So that's one of the problems. It's like when they argue about my real liberalism, my who are the the Dems are the real racists. It's just so tiresome. And they really fundamentally don't understand why they're losing, and that is like um, empirically tied to their attachment to liberalism. But like I say, it's how can I put it? It's too late because there isn't going to be like some ideology that's going to come along and contradict liberalism. All of those ideologies will develop outside the West, not within the West, and that again comes down to the concern of why America and Western power is concerned about other states like, say, Russia and China, who could forge a way of navigating the modern world and the deleterious effects that it has on society, but not be liberal, right? So,
Yes, and that actually segments
yes, supporting certain.
into another story I was going to bring up, but do continue.
Sure.
So the
Right. So, well, go ahead. Actually, I'm basic. I'm done actually with.
okay, so
Yeah,
the Hungarian
yeah.
Foreign Ministry
Go ahead.
did
Honestly,
did put out a statement regarding the anniversary of the 1956 revolution against the communist government, saying that we're in much the same position as we were in 1956, sort of implying that they are this country surrounded by an oppressive ideology that would be that of the American Empire and liberalism this time. That's at least how I interpreted the message from Novak, who was the Hungarian foreign minister. And again, it, in terms of it coming from outside the West, now you could say countries like Hungary, Poland, whatever, for what you take them, they're on the periphery of the West, sort of one foot in, one foot out. But again, you can see the amount of fear and, frankly, disgust they have for a country that has really no sway on the world stage at all, like Hungary, developing these alternative ways of doing things. And I do think you bring up a good point with that. That again, the West has been so
Right.
thoroughly capitulated, and frankly, I would say just in terms
Right.
of life force left in civilization, doesn't really have the energy or wherewithal or the creativity at this point to come up with an alternative system, which is why they fear again Russia and China so much, or like I said, even like a Hungary or Iran at that point, because they're showing illiberal ways of building what one could call a functional society. And with
Uh-huh.
that being
Uh-huh.
said, getting into the final story I had is China has allegedly tested physics defying hypersonic missiles. Now, these are the reports given to Congress, and they do seem embellished, I will admit. Something trying to really get more money for the military industrial complex, as one would expect. Even though, for listeners of this show and people who follow these sort of topics, they'll know since about 2018, 2019, that Russia and China have been leading the charge when it comes to hypersonic missile technology. And you could say that in 2018, with the two war game projects conducted by the United States at that point, they more or less concluded that the hypersonic missile was the death knell of the aircraft carrier, which of course is the basis of the American fleet, the basis of American naval power, at least at this point. And what they concluded in the South China Sea and in the Baltic Sea simulations that they lose handily in both. People talk a lot about the Chinese one, which is what I'll be focusing on now because, again, we're referencing Chinese missiles, even though a lot of these projects are conducted in maybe not an official cooperation, but a more or less understood cooperation between Russia and China when it comes to these hypersonic missiles. Again, this counter to American naval power. Now, I am inclined to believe, of course, we know that Russia and China have the edge on this technology, that they have outclassed us and outpaced us in this technology. But I am inclined to believe that these reports, these physics-defying ones, might be a little embellished for the sake of, uh, panhandling to Congress, if you will. Now, one could only assume how I would ever come to such a conclusion like that, but it does seem strange, and I'm sure you've all kept up with the absolute insanity coming out of the military in the past, year or two, coming to that. Whether it's transgender troops or General Milley or any of these sort of things, again, it's just scandal after scandal out of the military, joke after joke out of the military about how much of a joke organization they're really becoming in that sense where you're getting to the point where you have right wingers and even right wingers who are veterans themselves saying like, "Wow, this isn't the army I served in," or stuff like that. Pretty much when you think Afghanistan, Iraq, early 2000s, military was sacrosanct. Even a legitimate criticism, even like a quote unquote constructive criticism, was considered like blasphemy of the highest degree to these people. And just 20 years later, you're getting them saying like, "What the hell has happened to this institution? Oh, how did it get like this?" And again, it just that general loss of faith in American institutions. I would say the military was really the last pillar to fall on that because it had been something, at least in American culture, I would say, post World Wars, that had really held that really high status of the American institutions, and even that is crumbling at that point. But all of these put together, whether it's between that and that, again, I think it's a desperate military top brass that is embroiled in scandals, whether it be the more memeable things like, again, Milley sitting in front of Congress talking about white rage or the transgender troop stuff, or these more concrete things like these war games against Russia and China, begging for more funds and begging for more attention so they can counter these threats that they've certainly shown themselves capable of. Of course, with their stunning defeat over the Taliban and ISIS and their stabilization of Iraq and Afghanistan, they've shown themselves very capable and that they deserve more funding in order to take on real challenges like Russia and China, as we've seen. Certainly not a military mired in scandals over the past 2, 3 decades, not at all. And this certainly isn't a ploy trying to regain some degree of legitimacy. I don't know where you'd ever get that
Uh-huh.
idea. You must be a disgusting conspiracy theorist that is funded by either Russia, China, or possibly both in this case, or maybe even Iran. Who knows?
Right. Um, yeah, I mean, I don't know if people are, if people on the right are going to get it. I don't think they're going to get it fast enough. And we are seeing, like, in the age of nuclear arms, of course, soft power is going to become even more important than it's ever been before. So people shouldn't underestimate soft power as a way of getting the kind of compliance. We've already seen what has developed with just the coup, right? How effective it can be.
Oh, certainly. And again, it becomes that thing where while you may look at these raw numbers, so to speak, when it comes to these war games, it is about projecting that image. And of course, the enforcement arm of the American empire has to conform to the state ideology. And that might not play well with, for example, some of the stuff I was getting into. Now, as you pointed out, I do think it is a too little too late sort of proposition where they should have realized this 10 years ago, at least, if not before then. And again, while it may not hold sway with that or the common person, when it comes to the people who actually matter, the people actually making decisions, this is what they like to see. And frankly, again, the nuclear issue is their biggest saving grace on this, and it takes just again Russia or China to call that bluff and to stomach those casualties in order to conduct those sort of conflicts. Now, I think something that's much more likely, which isn't likely at this point, but I'm just saying is more likely, is what we saw with what was the name of that one war game drill in it was like something Millennium, like Operation Millennium was the 2002 war games against Iran where they sunk the Fifth Fleet within 12 hours, some ridiculous
Right,
figure
right.
like that. But again, you'd more likely see something like that that would just like mire the military in like an actual high casualty scandal than you would in the South China Sea or Baltic Sea. Even though that's not to downplay the level of tension with Russia or China right now, I'm just saying it would probably be a sort of David and Goliath situation where a much smaller, unsuspecting country would be able to deal with that. And frankly, that might look even worse because if a country, if the second or third most powerful in the world, the if one of the top three does that to another one of the top three, that's to be expected. That's something that doesn't surprise you that much. But
Uh-huh.
when you're Iran, who has been sanctioned to high hell for the past 40 years, and that most people think is this backwards Middle Eastern country, yeah, that's going to raise some eyebrows. That's going to really call things into question. The fact that a country like that could do that to the world's preeminent empire. And again, maybe that is on the horizon. I do think, as we said, the chapter of a direct confrontation with Iran has been closed. I think we established that sometime back in March, April, back when Biden was actually trying to revive Iran deal talks. Again, I don't see that. I don't know. Maybe there's some really hawkish, very Zionist Republican that replaces in 2024 that decides now's the time. We've dithered long enough. War with Iran now. Maybe that's when it happens. Again, I don't know. I'm not a fortune teller here. I'm not. I can't see into the future as many of the show's predictions may imply. I can't actually, but um, with that being said, again, it would take something probably more like that in order to do that. But so long as the U.S. military isn't expected to fight a real conflict, that they can't just send a small amount of serious troops who are actually still capable of combat into some irrelevant zone, some unheard of zone, like in Iraq, like in Afghanistan, where they can do these sort of things and get out quickly or maintain a small shadow presence, these problems won't come to head. It will actually require that the military as an entire organization has to conduct a mission. Again, probably something we haven't seen, I would say, just in general terms speaking, since like Vietnam. Again, if there's even like another Vietnam scale war, I think that's when the U.S. military is in deep shit, not just the current. I don't even know the word for it. The current state that we're in, where we're not really fighting any significant wars in terms of that actually require a concerted effort from the military that isn't just a few special forces or whatever.
Right, and it's also one of the reasons why the U.S. doesn't want to get involved in an all-out war either in Europe or in Asia. It has to do with manufacturing, right? It doesn't have the manufacturing base in order to do it, so it would lose on that front. Now, that's at the moment. Like, you could argue that AUKUS is the preparation for a possible war in 10 years. At the moment, they don't have what it takes to do that. In 10 years, however, the problem could be that it's en passé. And in fact, that in 5 years, the Chinese economy will surpass the American economy. And it's becoming even more difficult to predict what will happen in 5 years. So I think in that case, uh, America is in a bigger bind than the Chinese are. Um, you know, I don't know. Perhaps the U.S. is using um, the Corona crisis as a kind of de facto, uh, like a de facto embargo against China. But the Chinese ships have actually docked, and they're going back without American goods. So I don't know. Make of that what you will. So it's done in a haphazard way, meaning maybe there is no intent. Maybe it's just a bonus. It's hard to say. But the manufacturing capacity of the U.S. right now is not there. America is enormously war weary. Um, they may espouse ideas about how we should protect Taiwan and blah blah blah, but I think the growing amount of division and problems within the U.S. and the fact that Taiwan is this far off island for them is not enough. I would venture to say that they would be more willing to go to war and support a war against Russia in Europe than they are in the South China Sea.
And I think it also does have to play into the demographic question within the United States. Of course, the United States being
Yes,
at this point
great
still a
point.
predominantly European country that is still a predominantly Anglo-Saxon derived culture, I think would be the best way to put it, where it would be much easier to rally Americans to arms to defend another European nation, even a Slavic nation like Ukraine, than it would for them to defend a nation full of Asians who, if you want to put it in very basic terms, don't look like them. I think, maybe they don't consciously think this, but if you were to actually pose your average American or average even Western European with this question, especially Western European, they would feel more kinship with a Slav than they would an East Asian. And I think
Mhm, mhm.
it's just really that basic to the point where, I mean, at the end of the day, I think even among the American public, the country you could most convince American people to rally to arms around at this point would still probably be Israel, for being honest. It would be the
Yeah,
Jewish
yeah.
state. And I think that's for a variety of factors, but I think at the end of the day, that would be first and foremost. But again, as politics shifts into East Asia, even with an American population growing more Hispanic, the Hispanics, even they have more of a tie to Europe than they do to East Asia. Again, it's going to be hard to convince an American population to care about defending one Asian population from another, especially when the Taiwanese are ethnically Chinese themselves and their country considers itself a government in exile of China. And even getting to that, you want to talk about our previous excursions in Asia, going all the way back to the war in the Philippines, of course, World War II against the Japanese. You look at the propaganda out of these wars; it's pretty much paying the white man versus the yellow man. And of course, Vietnam.
Hmm.
It's like, again, even as recent as Vietnam, it's the white man versus the yellow man. It's not about defending one yellow man from the other. And again, that's something that would be completely unacceptable within the internal ideology of the American regime today. You couldn't foster a quote unquote racial conflict. You couldn't use racial propaganda to rally people to arms in East Asia like they have in previous wars they had to fight in East Asia.
Right. All great points. Um, it's not there. Maybe again, America needs it really needs allies, because this is not going to be like the conflicts in Iraq or Afghanistan. Um, and again, I have to stress. I think um, none of these countries wants, like, they want a solution, but they don't want this solution to their problem. Not in this way. Um, I would hazard a guess that there's several people even in Biden's administration that um, want some other deal, because essentially America hasn't really been offering any deals, right? That in any way question its supremacy and hegemony, right? Like, essentially they threaten Russia, right? Like, you're not going to have any more ties with China. It's best in your interest to work with us. Okay, what do we get out of it? Well, you get kind of nothing. Uh, you can't argue Nord Stream 2 is an example of this policy, because Nord Stream 2 is something that the Germans wanted, and, like, it's a conflict of interest if you're going to work towards the Paris Climate Accord, and you don't have enough gas to heat your civilization. So that's not really like a contradiction, if people want to use that as an example. Um, so they have not offered anything, and you can see that Russia severing any kind of ties with NATO is an example of this. Um, they're going to have to come up with deals, but that will mean there are certain areas of the world where America had more sway, more power, both hard and soft, that they will lose, right? And I think that's the problem. America sees that as a problem.
And also
Uh,
put this all in the context. The way you're describing it, again, I'm not saying this is what you're saying, but like the way that most people would take your description of this would be the concept that America was what it was in 2002 or 2003, when it was still something of a functional civilization and military power. Now,
yeah,
compile all of the internal issues we've just talked about this episode and all the previous episodes, put that on there, put that into our imperial policy, and try to mesh the two. And again, you were pointing out AUKUS. Like, sure, we can woo Australia and New Zealand into this sort of coalition, but put all of this in the context that America internally is coming apart at the seams. Some may say that's an exaggeration, but I'm willing to outright say at this point America is coming apart at the seams.
yeah. I mean, a lot of Americans, honestly feel that way. It's not like it's like they're going, anecdotally, you could argue, um, but they are making these observations, and I think they genuinely feel that. And you could, I guess, another way you could test the veracity of this is just look at the amount of effort the news media spends in being able to produce a message of unity and a scapegoat at the same time. And it's always, the white population of America, the conservative population of America, that's the scapegoat as to why America cannot heal, and why there is still division, right? Like, if the problem wasn't that big, the media wouldn't be doing this. Let's not forget that the media was never this explicit, and this message was never so consistent just 5 years ago.
I think
Um,
that's a good point right there that when they have to be that ham-fisted with their propaganda, they're in what can only be described as a major panic. They know that things are not going their way and that immediate damage control is needed on their part. And right now, they're just pulling out the media. Again, we talked about the hard power versus soft power, even on the internal distinction. But again, one could argue the situation is going to be pushed to the point. And I do think we saw the protests in Australia, where physical force might become the name of the game. And again, I think they're priming the American population for that, as you were saying. And you even had Biden talking about at the MLK memorial upon the anniversary of the assassination about domestic terrorism and pretty much the whole like white rage rhetoric. And some could say that they were really priming for what the next move is going to be. That distance or the regime are domestic terrorists and white nationalists, and put any other label on it that you'd like. But again, when they're getting that ham-fisted with propaganda, the ultimate point right there is that obviously something is wrong, and obviously they're trying a very rapid, correction of course.
Yes, yes. Otherwise, it would not have the consistency that it's had for so long now, right? So yes, internally it is a highly divided country.
And let's see there. And if you have anything else, I suppose we could continue on that. But that's all I had for today.
No, that's about it for myself as well.
Okay, and well, I hope everyone enjoyed this episode of the War Report. Nice Saturday episode. Once again, Shabbat Shalom to all of our Jewish viewers. I know there's many of you. But with that being said, thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll be back sometime next week. Again, we don't. If you can't tell, we don't really have a consistent day of the week we release these things on. It's more just we're working around schedules, okay? And of course, we have a man on the run from the Canadian state. We all know that the Mounties. I can hear them outside of his door right now. Like, so we really got to wrap this up, okay? They found the Macedonian spy. They found the man who will not comply with the you know what mandates. And
Yes.
this may be the last episode you see GSP, and if so, I just want to let you know you've been a valued member of the team. I don't know where this show would be without you. And frankly, after doing an episode alone, man, do I need a co-host. And I think you do an okay job. But with that being said, we'll hopefully see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take